Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to pull out the most important insights from the sources you share with us.
That's the goal.
And today we're tackling something that, well, it puzzles a lot of innovators, doesn't it? Why do some new ideas, some ventures just fizzle out even with brilliant people and tons of hard work, while others seem to just take off?
Yeah, it's that classic image, isn't it? The visionary entrepreneur, the creative genius maybe, the person with the right stuff.
Right, the rags to riches story. It's super compelling. But does it actually tell us why some succeed and so many others fail? Especially when you see people pour everything they have, their time, their passion, into an idea.
And it just doesn't land. It's incredibly frustrating.
And that romantic view, it kind of sets you up, doesn't it?
It really does. It gives you that ready-made excuse like, oh, well, we just didn't have the right stuff, or we weren't visionary enough.
Instead of looking at the process.
Exactly. It makes success seem like this innate magical quality rather than something you can actually learn and, manage systematically. It skips right over the practical stuff, the maybe boring details, the actual strategic choices that make the difference.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. This deep dive is all about Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. And our mission, well, it's not just to give you a summary.
No, definitely not.
We want to give you a shortcut, really, to being properly informed about this whole method. A method that actually promises to, and this is a quote, improve the success rate of new innovative products worldwide.
Which is a pretty bold claim.
It is. So we'll be pulling out the practical lessons, looking at how you might apply these ideas in your own work, maybe even your daily life, like when does this apply, where, how, and trying to get under the skin of what the author really means.
Yeah, getting beyond just the buzzwords. Our goal is really to give you insights you can actually use, things that might challenge how you think about building anything new, whether it's a small side project or, a big company initiative.
It's less about some kind of magic formula.
And much more about what Ries calls a scientific process that can be learned and replicated.
Okay, let's start then. Let's set the stage by looking at the problem. Why do the traditional ways of doing things often fall short? We've mentioned that romantic entrepreneur myth.
The rags to riches thing.
Yeah.
Success seems inevitable if you're just, special enough.
But the reality Eric Ries talks about from his own experience, particularly at his company IMVU, it was quite different.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about how their previous company had, I think the phrase was, failed very publicly.
Ouch.
Yeah, so their credibility was at an all-time low.
Yeah.
But they still had this huge vision for IMVU, this idea about changing communication using avatars.
So what did they do differently? Because the temptation might be to doubt yourself after a failure like that.
Right. But instead, they decided to completely change their approach. They were, quote, determined to make new mistakes, which I love. It's like, okay, the old way didn't work. Let's try messing up in a different way.
So not trying to perfect everything up front.
Exactly. Instead of spending years polishing the tech, they deliberately built what he calls a minimum viable product, or MVP. And he's very clear this first version was terrible, full of bugs, and crash your computer, yes, really, stability problems.
Wow, okay.
And they shipped it to customers way before it's ready.
Yeah.
They even charged money for it, which just flew in the face of the conventional wisdom that says your product has to be perfect, polished, before anyone sees it.
That really highlights the issue with traditional management, doesn't it? There's this allure of a good plan. In the past, maybe in more stable times, having that good plan, a solid strategy, thorough market research, that was the sign you were going to succeed.
Yeah.
So the instinct is, okay, let's apply that to a new venture, a startup.
But here's the critical question Ries raises.
Yeah.
What happens when you apply those methods to a situation they weren't built for?
Because startups operate under, what did he call it?
Conditions of extreme uncertainty.
Yeah.
That's the key phrase. You do not yet know who their customer is or what their product should be.
Everything's an unknown.
Pretty much. The future's unpredictable. Customers have tons of choices. So trying to create this detailed long-term plan in that environment, the old management methods are not up to the task. They just can't cope.
So, okay, if the old planning methods don't work, what's the alternative? Some people just swing the other way, right, into that just do it mentality.
Yeah, the just do it trap.
Yeah.
The thinking is, if management is the problem, chaos is the answer. Just throw something out there and hope for the best.
But that doesn't work either.
No. Ries is very clear from his own experience, this doesn't work either. It sounds weird, maybe, that a chaotic startup needs management, but all that passion, energy, and vision, those are resources too precious to waste.
And if you waste them by just doing stuff without learning,
You end up with what he calls Achieved failure, which is such a powerful term, is when a company successfully, faithfully, and rigorously executes a plan that turned out to have been utterly flawed.
Wow. So you did everything right according to the plan.
But the plan itself was wrong. He gives an example of a company that forecast millions of customers for a new product, invested huge amounts, big flashy launch, and the customers did not flock to the product in great numbers. They'd invested too much in its initial plan and could not adapt in time.
It's just wasted effort.
It's more than that. Ries calls it a colossal waste of our civilization's most precious resource, the time, passion, and skill of its people. It's not just about money. It's about that human potential. It goes back to that Peter Drucker quote, right? Doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all.
Okay, so to fight against this waste, Ries offers a different definition. What is a startup, according to him?
Yeah, this is really foundational. He defines a startup as a human institution designed to create new products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
A human institution under conditions of extreme uncertainty. That's interesting.
It's crucial because it broadens the idea of an entrepreneur way beyond just, two people in a garage somewhere in Silicon Valley.
Right. It could be a team inside a big company or a nonprofit, anyone facing that massive uncertainty about customers and product.
Exactly. And it also stresses that a startup isn't just a product. It's an institution, an acutely human enterprise. You've got hiring, culture, all that stuff. And that understanding is what allows this new kind of management to be applied, even right at the messy beginning.
Okay, so to make this really clear, he uses a metaphor. Driving a car versus launching a rocket ship. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a great one. He looks at Henry Ford's car. It has two key feedback loops. First, the engine itself, those tiny explosions happening in sequence, needing precise timing. That's like a startup's engine of growth.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time tuning the engine, improving the product, the marketing operations.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second loop?
The second loop is the driver and the steering wheel. You're constantly making small, immediate, almost automatic adjustments to stay on the road.
Ah, okay. And that's where the rocket ship comparison comes in.
Exactly. Because many traditional business plans are like launching a rocket. They lay out all the steps in excruciating detail. But the problem is, the tiniest error at the point of launch could yield catastrophic results thousands of miles later.
And there's no steering wheel on a rocket once it's launched. You're committed.
Precisely. You just follow the plan. But the lean and startup method, it's completely different. It's about how to drive a startup. It's about making those constant adjustments with the steering wheel.
And that steering wheel is?
The build, measure, learn feedback loop. That's the core mechanism. It helps you figure out when and if it's time to make a sharp turn called a pivot, or whether we should persevere along our current path. It's all about adapting to what you learn from reality, not just sticking blindly to a flawed plan.
Okay, that makes the core idea much clearer. So this leads us to the fundamental principles of lean startup. You said there are 5.
Yeah, 5 foundational principles that really underpin the whole approach. They guide everything.
Let's go through them. What's the first one?
First, entrepreneurs are everywhere. This circles back to that definition. You don't have to be in a garage. You don't have to fit that stereotype of the young visionary with little backing.
Right.
Ries says it applies to anyone who works within his definition of a startup. That human institution creating something new under extreme uncertainty.
Can you give an example of this in practice, like not in a typical startup?
Absolutely. Intuit SnapTax is a fantastic example. Intuit, huge Fortune 1000 company, makes TurboTax, right? Massive player in tax software.
Yeah, everyone knows TurboTax.
So they developed SnapTax, this amazing innovation where you could just take a photo of your W-2 form with your phone and do your taxes.
Which sounds like it competes directly with TurboTax.
It absolutely did. This is the classic innovator's dilemma, isn't it? Big companies struggle with disruptive ideas because they threaten the existing profitable core business.
So how did Intuit manage it? Was the SnapTax team like some secret skunkworks project?
Not really. They weren't in a garage. They had proper salaries, benefits. But their success came because Intuit's senior management deliberately facilitated it. They created an island of freedom for this team to experiment.
So top-down support was key.
Hugely important. And it came from the top. Intuit's founder, Scott Cook, apparently had this realization back in 2002 that too many of its new products were failing. He saw that their standard, well-managed approach was actually inadequate for real innovation.
And that led to changes.
Big changes. By 2009, Intuit was running hundreds of experiments just during tax season for TurboTax Online, like up to 70 different tests per week. Cook said it helped them develop entrepreneurs who run and learn and can retest and relearn, as opposed to a society of politicians.
Wow. Creating internal entrepreneurs.
Yeah. And it shows that senior leaders have a massive responsibility here to build the systems that allow this kind of experimentation, that foster that entrepreneurial spirit inside the company.
This links to the idea of entrepreneurs, right? People inside large organizations trying to innovate.
Exactly. Ries talks about a general manager, he calls him Mark, who had everything you'd think an entrepreneur needs. Proper team structure, good personnel, a strong vision, and appetite for risk-taking. But he was missing a process. He didn't know how to convert the raw materials of innovation into real-world breakthrough successes. He needed guidance. Well, what process should it use? How should it be held accountable? The lean startup framework gives those entrepreneurs the how.
Okay, so that makes sense. Entrepreneurs are everywhere. What's principle number 2?
Principle 2 builds right on that. Entrepreneurship is management. Because a startup is an institution, not just a product, it therefore requires a new kind of management, specifically designed to steer it through that uncertainty towards sustainable growth.
So it's not chaos, it needs management, but a different kind of management.
Precisely. It pushes back against that idea that startups are inherently unmanageable, all that passion and energy, too precious to waste. Good management channels it effectively.
Got it. And principle 3?
Principle 3, validated learning. This one is huge. Maybe the core shift in thinking. The main purpose of a startup is not just to make stuff, make money, or even serve customers.
Okay, wait. Not to make money or serve customers. What is the purpose then?
According to Ries, they exist to learn how to build a sustainable business. That's the primary goal. And this learning isn't just gut feeling. It has to be validated scientifically by running frequent experiments.
Learning validated by data.
Yes. And again, Ries uses his IMVU experience. As CTO, he used to measure progress by, did we finish the features, the quality good? Did we stay on budget?
Standard metrics.
Right. But then he started worrying, what if we found ourselves building something that nobody wanted? In that case, what did it matter if we did it on time and on budget? The real progress, he realized, was what we had learned about what creates value for customers. Shifting from output to validated learning, that's fundamental.
Okay, so how do you actually do that? How do you get validated learning?
That brings us to principle 4, build, measure, learn. This is the engine, the fundamental activity of a startup. It's that continuous feedback loop you mentioned.
Right, build something.
Turn ideas into products, then measure.
Measure how customers respond and learn.
And then learn whether to pivot or persevere. All successful startup processes, Ries argues, are really just trying to accelerate that feedback loop, make it spin faster.
Build, measure, learn. Okay. And the last principle, number 5.
Principle 5 is innovation accounting. This sounds maybe a bit dry, but it's critical. To actually improve results and hold innovators accountable, you have to focus on, as Ries puts it, the boring stuff. How to measure progress, how to set up milestones, and how to prioritize work.
So different metrics than traditional accounting.
Totally different. Because standard accounting just isn't helpful for evaluating entrepreneurs navigating extreme uncertainty. You need a new kind of accounting designed for startups.
Okay, so those are the 5 principles. Entrepreneurs are everywhere. Entrepreneurship is management, validated learning, build, measure, learn, and innovation accounting. That gives us the why and the what. Now, let's really get into the how. How does this build, measure, learn cycle actually work in practice? Starting with build and the minimum viable product, the MVP.
Right, the MVP. It's probably one of the most talked about concepts from the book, but maybe also one of the most misunderstood.
How so? What is an MVP, really?
Well, Ries defines it as not necessarily the smallest product imaginable. That's key. It's not just about making something tiny. It's about the fastest way to get through the build, measure, learn feedback loop with a minimum amount of effort.
Fastest way through the loop. Minimum effort. Okay.
Its whole purpose is to start the process of learning as quickly as possible. Specifically, learning about your biggest assumptions, what Ries calls your leap of faith assumptions. Those core beliefs your whole idea rests on.
And who are you building this MVP for? Not everyone, right?
No, definitely not. This is where early adopters are absolutely crucial. These are the customers who use their imagination to fill in what a product is missing. They want to be first, maybe for a competitive edge, or just because they love new things.
So you don't need all the bells and whistles for them.
Exactly. Ries says pretty bluntly that additional features or polish beyond what early adopters demand is a form of wasted resources and time. If you're building something new, target those early adopters first. It saves you so much guesswork.
But that feels risky. Doesn't it feel wrong to release something incomplete?
Oh, absolutely. Ries acknowledges this. There's a dangerous feeling to MVPs. Most entrepreneurs, especially if they're perfectionists, they dream of this polished, slick, and ready for prime time launch.
Yeah.
So releasing an early, buggy, incomplete product feels like an unacceptable compromise. But you have to be willing to set aside our traditional professional standards to start the process of validated learning as soon as possible.
Yeah.
It takes discipline.
Let's look at some examples. How have companies actually used MVPs? You mentioned Groupon earlier.
Right. Groupon, huge company now. But it started as something called The Point, a platform for collective action that wasn't really taking off. So the founder, Andrew Mason, pivoted to test group coupons.
And the MVP was?
Literally just a handmade PDF, a pizza coupon, and a simple blog. Super basic, not exactly world-changing tech, but it worked. It proved people wanted group discounts. That simple test launched Groupon.
Okay, what about something more technical, like Dropbox? File syncing seems complicated.
Yeah, very complicated. And they had this problem. People didn't know they had the problem of needing easy file sync back then. Building a working prototype would have taken ages and tons of engineering effort.
So what did they do?
The founder, Drew Houston, made a video, a simple screencast, showing how the software would work, demonstrating the magic of it. He filled it with in-jokes for the early tech adopter crowd he was targeting.
A video, not a product.
Exactly. And that video drove hundreds of thousands of people to the website. Their beta waiting list exploded from 5,000 people to 75,000 people, literally overnight. They validated massive demand before building the complex product. The insight there is huge. Sometimes your MVP doesn't have to be code at all.
Okay, another one, food on the table. What was their MVP?
This was a service for personalized meal plans and grocery lists. Their MVP was pure manual effort. It was a concierge MVP.
Meaning
The CEO and the VP of product personally visited early customers, figured out their needs, created the shopping lists and recipes by hand, and then collected $9.95 checks from them.
wow, that's not scalable.
Not at all. But that wasn't the point. That personalized service is not the product, but a learning activity designed to test the leap of faith assumptions. Did people actually value this service enough to pay for it? By doing it manually first, they could scale something that was working rather than trying to invent something that might work.
Learning first, scaling later. Okay, what about Aardvark? That sounds like AI.
Yeah, they wanted to build a sort of virtual assistant for subjective questions Google couldn't easily answer. Building the AI for that. Super hard.
So another video.
No, this time it was a Wizard of Oz MVP. They built prototypes that looked like software, but behind the scenes, human beings are doing the work.
Ah, the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. It was incredibly inefficient. At scale, obviously. But it allowed them to answer the fundamental questions. If we can solve the tough technical problems, will people use it? Will their use lead to the creation of a product that has real value? They tested the value proposition before cracking the complex tech. They pivoted multiple times based on that learning until they found something that worked and Google eventually bought them.
It seems like the MVP really forces you to confront what customers actually care about.
It really does. There's a great story from IMVU about their avatars. Initially, the avatars just stood still. The team kind of reluctantly added a teleportation feature you click, and the avatar instantly moves to that spot.
Okay.
They felt it was low quality, compared to smooth walking animations in games like The Sims. They thought users would hate it. But users loved it. Customers consistently listed avatar teleportation among the top 3 features they liked. Some even called it more advanced than The Sims.
Wow. So quality isn't just about technical polish.
Not at all. The lesson was crystal clear. Customers don't care how much time something takes to build. They care only if it serves their needs. Quality, in the lean startup view, is defined by customer value, not developer effort or perceived sophistication.
So the rule for MVPs is?
The golden rule for MVPs is remove any feature, process, or effort that does not contribute directly to the learning you seek. If it doesn't help you test a core assumption about your customer or your market, it's waste. Cut it.
But building MVPs isn't always smooth sailing, is it? What are the common roadblocks?
Yeah, there are definitely speed bumps. Legal stuff, like patent filings, can be tricky, but the most common objection Ries hears is fear of competitors. People worry someone will steal their idea if they release it early.
Is that a valid fear?
Ries argues it's mostly overblown. First, it's near impossible for a tiny startup to even get noticed by a big competitor. Second, if a competitor can easily copy your idea and out-execute you just because they saw your MVP, well, the startup is doomed anyway.
So secrecy isn't the answer.
No. The real competitive advantage is learning faster than anyone else. Secrecy won't fix fundamental problems with your model. Other fears include branding risks. Will a low-quality MVP damage our reputation? And team morale. What if the MVP performs badly, a false negative, and the team gives up?
And the solution to those fears?
A deep commitment to iteration, understanding that the first MVP is just the start of the learning process, not the end result.
Okay, so we've built our MVP. Now we move to the measure phase. This is where innovation accounting comes in, right?
Exactly. And Ries argues pretty strongly that standard accounting metrics just don't work for startups.
Why not?
Because startups are too unpredictable for forecasts and milestones to be accurate. Traditional metrics often end up measuring things like, are we busy? Are we spending the budget? They don't measure actual progress towards a sustainable business. They don't measure learning.
So what does innovation accounting measure? How does it work? You said 3 steps.
Yeah, 3 steps. First, you use your MVP to establish baseline data. Get those real numbers on where you are right now. Even if the numbers look terrible, you need that clear-eyed picture. You need a starting line.
Okay, baseline establish. Step 2.
Step 2 is tune the engine. This is where you start running experiments. You implement changes, new features, different marketing messages, maybe operational tweaks, all aimed at improving specific drivers of its growth model. Every change is a hypothesis. If we do X, we expect Y metric to improve.
And then you measure if it actually did improve.
Right, which leads to step 3, the big decision point. Pivot or persevere. If your tuning efforts are consistently improving the metrics, moving you toward your goal, you persevere. But if the improvements stop, or if the metrics show your fundamental assumptions were wrong, you need to pivot, make a significant strategic change.
But measuring the right things seems critical here. You mentioned vanity metrics earlier.
Oh yeah, the danger of vanity metrics. This is a huge trap. These are metrics that look good on the surface but don't actually reflect the health of the business. Things like total number of customers registered or total questions answered on a platform.
They make you feel good but don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. They give you the sensation of forward motion even though the company was making little progress. IMVU fell into this. They worked for months, made thousands of improvements, ran focus groups, product usage went up.
Sounds good.
But the percentage of new customers who actually paid money stayed flat, stuck at around 1%. All that work wasn't moving the needle on the core business metric. The vanity metrics, like usage, masked the real problem.
Why are vanity metrics so tempting?
Ries says they prey on a weakness of the human mind. When the numbers go up, everyone wants to take credit. My department's efforts worked. But when they go down,
It's somebody else's fault.
right, it fuels departmental silos, blame games, jargon, defense mechanisms. You get this situation where every department is constantly making things better, only to have their hard work sabotaged by other departments that just don't get it. It's toxic.
And it leads to what he calls success theater.
Yeah, all that energy spent making the superficial, gross numbers look good. Last-minute ad buys, channel stuffing, whiz-bang demos. It's energy that could have been used to help build a sustainable business.
So what's the alternative? Actionable metrics.
Actionable metrics. These are the antidote. They have 3 key characteristics. First, they're actionable. They allow clear cause and effect inferences. You run an experiment, the metric changes, and you know why. It tells you what to do next.
Okay, actionable. What else?
Second, accessible. The reports need to be simple, comprehensible, using tangible, concrete units. Think actual active customers, not vague website hits. And crucially, they need to be widely shared. Grocket, an online learning company, used to email key metrics daily to every single employee.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. It builds shared understanding and accountability. And third, auditable. The data needs to be credible and verifiable. People need to trust the numbers. This helps teams settle arguments based on data, not opinions, and avoids blame the messenger situations.
Can you give an example of actionable metrics in use? You mentioned Grocket.
Yeah, Grocket's a great case study. Their founder, Farbood Nivi, started using split testing, or A/B testing, in their product development. They tested different study modes, social versus solo.
What did they find?
They found that adding more social features did not change customer behavior in the way they expected. But when they tested a dedicated solo studying mode, that resonated. They learned what customers actually valued through experimentation, not just assumptions.
And they use Kanban too, right? But with a twist.
Yeah, they adopted Kanban for workflow, but they added a crucial rule. User stories were not considered complete until they led to validated learning.
Wow. So just coding the feature wasn't enough.
Not at all. A feature could be technically done, but stuck in limbo until the team could prove, with data, that it actually had the intended impact on user behavior or metrics. If it didn't, they had to investigate why. This completely shifted their definition of productivity. It became about validated learning, not in terms of the production of new features.
That's a radical shift.
It really is. They even tested something seemingly obvious, like lazy registration, letting users try the product before signing up. Conventional wisdom says that's better.
And was it?
For them, no. They tested it against immediate registration, and both groups had exactly the same behavior rates later on. It made no difference, which meant all the effort they might have put into building lazy registration would have been a complete waste. It suggested their efforts might be better spent elsewhere, like on marketing.
Testing assumptions, even the obvious ones. Okay, so we've measured using actionable metrics. Now we reach the learn phase. This is where the pivot or persevere decision comes in.
Right. And Ries calls this the entrepreneur's hardest question. Deciding whether to stick with your current strategy or make a significant change, a pivot. It's tough, but critical.
Why is this so critical?
Because if you don't pivot when the data tells you to, you risk ending up in the land of the living dead.
The land of the living dead. Sounds grim.
It is, in a business sense.
Yeah.
It's when a company has achieved a modicum of success, just enough to stay alive, but is not living up to the expectations of its founders and investors. It's just sort of shuffling along. And these companies are a terrible drain of human energy. People are working hard, but not really going anywhere meaningful.
So pivoting helps you avoid that fate. Can you give an example of a company that pivoted effectively?
Vodafone is a great example of multiple pivots. The CEO, David Benetti, started with an idea for a social network for verified voters to boost civic engagement. He launched his first MVP quickly, got some early adopters. But the key metrics, user retention, referrals, they stayed flat, even after optimizing for months. The engine wasn't tuning up.
So time to pivot.
Yep. Based on user feedback like, there's no one here, he did a zoom-in pivot. He took one feature of the original product, social lobbying, and made that the entire focus. They became, at 2Gov, turning digital messages into paper letters to Congress.
Did that work?
The metrics improved dramatically. Referrals shot up, retention got better, but willingness to pay was still less than 1%. Still stuck.
So another pivot.
Yes. This time, a customer segment pivot. He realized maybe passionate individual consumers weren't the right target. He shifted focus to large organizations, businesses with a professional interest in political campaigning. B2C to B2B.
Okay.
And then one more pivot, a platform pivot. He envisioned a self-serve platform, kind of like Google AdWords, but for this social lobbying. And that version, which only took another month to build, finally showed the beginning of an actual growth model that could work. Paying customers, strong referrals.
Wow. What's fascinating there is how the pivots got faster.
Exactly. The first MVP cycle took 8 months, then 4, then 3, then just 1 month. That acceleration wasn't just about getting better at coding. It was because they were learning critical things about its customers, market, and strategy with each loop. Faster learning equals faster iteration.
Any other pivot examples?
Wealthfront is another interesting one. They started out as something called Ka-Ching, basically a fantasy stock-picking league, an online game. They got huge numbers, like 450,000 gamers.
Sounds like success.
Vanity metric alert. Turns out almost none of those gamers converted into actual paying customers managing real money. I think only 14 signed up initially. Conversion was close to 0.
Ouch. So they pivoted.
They had to. They pivoted away from being an online game to being a paid financial product, the automated investment service they are today. They realized the initial success wasn't a real sustainable business.
Even IMVU had to pivot, didn't they? Despite their early success.
Ries talks about this very honestly. They had $1 million a month, 20 million avatars looks great, right? But he says, unknowingly, we had fallen into a classic startup trap. They were just chasing growth, revenue, and profits wherever we could find them.
What was the trap?
They missed the need to pivot even as it stared us in the face. They realized their product, which worked great for early adopters, wasn't quite right for the mainstream customers they were now attracting. Those customers had different needs, higher expectations.
So they needed a
customer segment pivot. They had to do a major product overhaul to serve this new, larger audience. Ressa says it felt like the company's second founding and wonders if they could have gotten there faster if they'd recognized the need to pivot sooner.
It sounds like pivoting takes real courage. It's admitting your initial strategy wasn't quite right.
It takes immense courage. Reason notes, ask most entrepreneurs who have decided to pivot, and they will tell you that they wish they had made the decision sooner. Those vanity metrics can trick you into delaying the inevitable. Even big names like Path faced harsh criticism for their early MVPs, but they had the courage to ignore this fear and focus on what their customers said. They learned and adapted.
Okay, so build, measure, learn is the core loop. How do you make that loop spin faster? How do you accelerate?
This is where the idea of working in small batches comes in. It's a concept borrowed from lean manufacturing, but it applies incredibly well to innovation.
Small batches, that sounds less efficient, like doing things one by one instead of all at once.
It sounds less efficient, but it's actually often much faster overall.
Yeah.
Ries uses this great envelope stuffing analogy. Imagine you and your kids have 100 party invitations to prepare. Fold the letter, stuff it in the envelope, seal it, put a stamp on.
Okay.
The kid's instinct is fold all 100 letters first, then stuff all 100, then seal all 100, then stamp all 100. Big batches for each step.
Seems logical, efficient for each task.
Right. But the father in the story does it differently. He takes one letter, folds it, stuffs it, seals it, stamps it, finishes one whole envelope, then does the next one. Single piece flow. And guess who finishes all 100 first?
The father, doing one at a time.
Yep. The father wins the race. It's counterintuitive, but working in small batches, even single piece flow, is often faster and reveals problems much earlier.
How does it reveal problems faster?
Think about the envelopes. What if the letters don't quite fit? Or maybe 10% of the envelopes are defective, the glue doesn't stick.
If you're doing big batches, you wouldn't find out until you've already folded all 100 letters or tried to seal all 100 envelopes.
Exactly. You find the problem late, and you might have a huge amount of rework. But with single-piece flow, you find the problem on the very first envelope or maybe the second. You get faster problem identification almost immediately with no rework required on a massive batch.
And you get finished products sooner, too.
Yeah, that's the other big benefit. With small batches, you have a finished stamped envelope ready to go every few seconds. With large batches, you get nothing finished until the very end, when all 100 are done all at once. Having finished units earlier means you could, in theory, get feedback sooner. Do people even like the invitation design?
This came from Toyota, right? Lean manufacturing.
Absolutely. Toyota and other Japanese car makers couldn't compete with the sheer scale of American mass production factories, so they had to innovate. They pioneered working in small batches. People like Taiichi Ohno and Shigeo Shingo developed techniques like SME, single-minute exchange of die.
What's that?
It was about drastically cutting the time it took to switch a machine from making one part to making a different part, like from hours down to minutes. This allowed them to produce a huge, wide variety of parts in small batches, increasing flexibility and reducing inventory waste.
And that famous andon cord at Toyota, that fits here too.
Perfectly. The andon cord allows any worker on the assembly line to pull a cord and stop the entire production line if they spot a quality problem.
That sounds crazy, stopping everything.
It's totally counterintuitive, isn't it? It seems massively inefficient. But Toyota realized the benefit of finding and fixing problems faster outweighs this cost. If you fix the root cause immediately, it prevents potentially hundreds of defective cars from being made further down the line. It embodies their paradoxical proverb, stop production so the production never has to stop.
Because quality issues will eventually stop you anyway, just much more painfully later on.
Precisely. You cannot trade quality for time. Taking shortcuts on quality today just creates delays and rework tomorrow.
So how does this small batches idea apply outside of manufacturing, like in software?
A key application is continuous deployment.
Yeah.
At IMVU, Ries talks about how they practice this, releasing new versions of their software dozens of times every single day.
Dozens of times a day? How is that even possible?
Through automation and small batches of changes. If a change introduced a defect, it affected only a tiny part of the system or a small number of users, and it was removed immediately. Everyone was notified, and no further changes could go out until the root cause of the problem is found and fixed. Even Wealthfront, in the highly regulated finance industry, practices continuous deployment. It's possible.
What about physical products, not just software?
Yep. Ries mentions SGW, a company making portable X-ray gear for the military. They use 3D CAD software for rapid communication between design and manufacturing. They could get initial physical prototypes machined from aluminum in just 3 days. The first production run of 40 units was ready in only 3.5 weeks. The feedback loop on design decisions was nearly instantaneous. Small batches accelerated everything.
And even education. You mentioned School of One.
Yeah, quite a surprising example. This school gives students individualized playlists of learning activities each day, tailored to their needs. Teachers use software to track progress. If they try a new curriculum sequence, they can immediately see the impact of the change on individual students' playlists and performance. It allows teachers to work in much smaller batches educationally, learning and adapting curriculum much faster than traditional methods.
So the opposite of this is the large batch death spiral.
Right. It starts innocently. A designer thinks it's more efficient for me to do all 30 drawings before I hand them off. A coder thinks I'll finish this whole complex module before I integrate it. Each person optimizes their own work in a large batch.
But the downstream effects are bad.
Terrible. It leads to rework, delays, and interruptions when things finally get integrated or tested. And over time, the batches tend to get bigger and bigger. Eventually, you end up with these massive bet-the-company projects where one batch will become the highest priority project, sucking up all resources and making it almost impossible to stop or change direction, even if it's clearly failing.
So how do you decide what to build in these small batches?
Instead of planning features, you use hypothesis pull. You start by asking, what do we need to learn right now to test our biggest assumption? Then you work backwards. What's the smallest experiment, the minimum product increment we can build to get that specific learning? The need for learning pulls the work.
Can you give an example of hypothesis pull?
Alphabet Energy, the clean tech startup. They had this material that could generate electricity from waste heat. Their initial hypothesis was power plants are the market, big source of waste heat.
Makes sense.
But they tested that hypothesis quickly, maybe built a tiny prototype or just had deep conversations. They learned power companies are extremely risk-averse and have long sales cycles. Hypothesis disproven, fast. So they pivoted, building small-scale solutions for its customers as a way of learning, testing different markets rapidly. This experimental approach cost them a tiny fraction of what other energy startups have consumed. They learned cheaply and quickly by pulling work based on hypotheses.
This all links back to that idea of building an adaptive organization, doesn't it? And avoiding trading quality for speed.
Absolutely. That speed-quality paradox is central. You cannot trade quality for time. Any shortcut you take today, skipping testing, building up technical debt, not training people properly, it will slow a company down tomorrow. It comes back to bite you through defects, rework, frustrated teams, unhappy customers.
So how do you find the root cause of these problems when they inevitably pop up?
The 5 whys, another powerful technique from the Toyota production system, credited to Taiichi Ohno. It's deceptively simple. When a problem occurs, you just keep asking why. About 5 times, digging deeper each time to get past the symptoms to the actual underlying, often systemic cause.
Can you walk through Ohno's classic example, the machine stopping?
Sure. So a machine on the factory floor stops working.
Okay. Why?
Because the fuse blew.
Okay. Why did the fuse blow?
Because the machine was overloaded.
Why was it overloaded?
Because the bearing wasn't being lubricated properly. It wasn't pumping.
Why wasn't it pumping?
Because the pump shaft was worn and rattling.
Okay, 5th why. Why was the shaft worn?
Because there was no strainer attached to the pump intake, so metal shadings got in and wore it down.
Yeah.
See how you went from a simple technical fault, blown fuse, to a process issue, no strainer installed.
Yeah, it peels back the layers. It wasn't just a faulty machine, it was a missing step in the process.
Exactly. It forces you beyond blaming the immediate symptom. IMVU use this too. Customer complaints about a new feature release. Why?
Okay, why?
Because a specific feature had been disabled. Why?
Why disabled?
Because his server kept failing. Why?
Server failure.
Because an obscure subsystem was being used improperly by the new feature. Why?
Improper use.
Because the engineer who wrote the code hadn't been trained on that subsystem. Final why.
Why wasn't the engineer trained?
Because his manager doesn't believe in training new engineers because he and his team are too busy. Boom. What started as a customer complaint about a feature quickly uncovered a very human managerial issue about training priorities.
That's powerful. It forces you to look at the system, not just the incident.
Right. And the idea isn't necessarily to launch a massive investigation for every tiny issue. Ries talks about the principle of proportional investment. Small problems might get a quick 5 whys and a small fix. Really painful, recurring problems warrant a deeper dive and a larger investment in prevention. You make incremental improvements that compound over time.
And the goal isn't blame, right?
Absolutely not. You have to actively avoid the 5 blames where frustrated people just start pointing fingers at each other, blaming other departments or individuals. The core belief has to be that chronic problems are caused by bad process, not bad people. That's a fundamental cultural shift.
QuickBooks had a big transformation using these ideas, didn't they?
Yeah, really compelling story. Greg Wright, who worked there, described the old way. Massive, annual, large batch releases for QuickBooks, a mission-critical product for small businesses.
So high stakes.
Very high. One year, his team shipped a technically perfect beta, but customer feedback was terrible. Things like, it took customers 4 to 5 times longer to reconcile their banking transactions. Major usability issues.
And that happened.
The feedback was essentially ignored because they were locked into the annual release schedule and deadlines. The product shipped, customers hated it, it failed to meet needs, and it took 9 months of painful fixes. A classic achieved failure, doing the wrong thing perfectly.
So how did they change?
They had what they called the Year 3 explosion. Greg and another leader, Himanshu Bakshi, basically tossed out all the old processes. They invested heavily in enabling small batches, changing processes, product architecture, technology.
What kind of changes?
They introduced things like idea code dilution jams, bringing engineers, product managers, and customers together early and often. They faced resistance, of course, from specialists who like their old, efficient silos. And a key tech investment was a virtualization system that let them test new QuickBooks versions safely on a customer's computer, using their live data without risk. That enabled incredibly fast, realistic feedback loops.
And the results.
Dramatic improvement in customer satisfaction, increased sales. They moved away from those big annual releases towards quarterly updates via subscription. It was about fundamentally changing the system to enable continuous learning and adaptation.
Okay, we've covered accelerating the loop. What about sustaining growth once you do find something that works? You mentioned engines of growth.
Right. Once you've iterated and maybe pivoted your way to something customers want, how do you scale it sustainably? The core rule Ries proposes is, new customers come from the actions of past customers. Sustainable growth isn't driven by one-off stunts like a big PR launch. It comes from built-in feedback loops.
And there are 3 main types of these loops, these engines.
Yeah, he identifies 3 primary engines of growth. Each one works like a combustion engine, turning over and over. The faster the loop turns, the faster the company will grow.
Okay, what's the first engine?
The sticky engine of growth. The goal here is simple. Attract customers and keep them for the long term. Retention is key.
So the main metric would be?
Churn rate. The percentage of customers who stop using your product or service over a given period. For the sticky engine to drive growth, your rate of new customer acquisition must be higher than your churn rate. The difference between those 2 rates determines your growth speed, your rate of compounding.
So if growth is flat with this engine, the answer isn't necessarily just get more new customers.
Exactly. That's the counterintuitive lesson. If your sticky engine is sputtering, you might need to focus intensely on improving retention, reducing churn, before pouring more money into acquisition. Plug the leaky bucket first.
Okay, sticky engine. What's number 2?
The viral engine of growth. This is when the product itself has mechanisms that cause it to spread automatically as people use it. Think word of mouth on steroids.
Like Hotmail back in the day.
The classic example. In 1996, they added that little line to the bottom of every email sent from their service. P.S. Get your free email at Hotmail. Every email sent became an ad for Hotmail. It led to insane growth, 12 million users in 18 months. Tupperware parties are another older example of viral mechanics.
What's the key metric for the viral engine?
The viral coefficient. This number represents how many new customers each existing customer brings in, on average. If the coefficient is greater than 1.0, each customer brings in more than 1 new customer, you get exponential growth. If it's less than 1, growth eventually fizzles out.
And viral products often don't charge directly.
Often, yes. They want to minimize any friction that would slow down the viral spread, like sign-up fees. So they often rely on indirect monetization. Advertising is common, where the user's attention is the product being sold.
Makes sense. Okay, third engine.
The paid engine of growth. This is more straightforward. Growth is fueled directly by paying to acquire customers through advertising, sales teams, etc.
So the metrics are about cost versus value.
Exactly. You track your cost per acquisition, CPA. How much does it cost you to get 1 new paying customer? And you compare that to the customer lifetime value, LTV. How much profit do you expect to make from that customer over their entire relationship with you?
And growth happens
If LTV is greater than CPA, the difference, the marginal profit per customer, determines how quickly you can reinvest in acquiring more customers and thus how fast you grow. This engine isn't just about online ads. It includes the costs of sales forces, retail rent, anything you pay to get customers.
Can a company use more than one engine?
Products can definitely have elements of all three. But Ries argues that successful startups usually focus on just one engine of growth at a time. They specialize in making that particular engine run as efficiently as possible. Trying to optimize all three simultaneously is usually too complex and dilutes focus. A pivot might even involve switching from one engine to another if the first one isn't working.
And these engines help determine product market fit.
Yes, because each engine provides clear, quantitative metrics. If your viral coefficient is consistently above 1.0, that's strong evidence you're nearing product market fit for a viral product. If your LTV is much higher than your CPA, your paid engine is working. These metrics help you focus product development on the things that will actually improve the performance of your chosen engine.
So zooming out now, what are the broader implications of all this? How does it change how we think about work, especially within larger organizations?
Well, one big implication is Ries's assertion that entrepreneur is a job title, or at least it should be a viable career path for innovators inside big companies.
Those entrepreneurs we talked about.
Right. He argues they need specific conditions to succeed. They need scarce but secure resources, meaning small, dedicated budgets that aren't constantly being fought over in political battles. They need independent authority to actually develop and test their business ideas. And they need a personal stake in the outcome, whether that's actual equity or significant career recognition and reward if the venture succeeds.
How can organizations create that space safely without disrupting the main business?
He proposes the idea of an innovation sandbox. It's a controlled environment for experimentation.
How does the sandbox work?
The basic mechanism is any team can run a true split test experiment, but it only affects a designated sandbox part of the product, or maybe only specific customer segments or geographic regions. One cross-functional team owns the experiment from idea to results. And crucially, experiments have a strict time limit, weeks, or maybe a couple of months.
What are the benefits of this sandbox approach?
It allows teams to make cheap mistakes quickly. It encourages rapid iteration. It builds fluency across the organization in using actionable metrics. It makes success or failure clear and data-driven. And importantly, it protects the parent organization from the potential chaos or risk of early-stage disruptive innovation. It also prevents innovation from being hidden away, which can breed paranoia and sabotage. It helps managers see the system of innovation at work.
It sounds like a way to institutionalize that learning process.
Exactly. And it directly attacks that massive problem of waste we discussed earlier, the waste of working on the wrong things efficiently.
Back to Drucker again.
Right back to Drucker. There is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. Ries argues our modern economy is incredibly wasteful, not because people are lazy or inefficient, but because we are systematically working on the wrong things and on an industrial scale. He calls it a misuse of people's time, a criminally negligent waste of human creativity and potential. His point is stark. Our current problems are caused by trying too hard at the wrong things.
So, understanding lean startup principles, it's like having a tool to identify the right things to work on.
Yeah, he even says it gives employees superpowers. Yeah. Someone who understands these ideas can walk into a meeting, hear a proposal, and immediately start asking questions about the fundamental leap of faith assumptions, the metrics, the proposed experiments. They can cut through the noise.
But the challenge is getting managers on board, getting them to see the system.
That's often the biggest hurdle. Getting managers to shift from just looking for brilliant people or relying on gut instinct to actually building and trusting a system for innovation. Because without that system, you fall into pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience in business?
Yeah, greenlighting projects based purely on someone's charisma or intuition. Engaging in that success theater, selectively finding data to justify a pre-existing vision. Staying in stealth mode for too long because it's a comfortable data-free zone. And maybe most subtly, he warns, anytime a team attempts to justify its failures by resorting to learning as an excuse, it is engaged in pseudoscience as well. Real learning needs validated data, not just saying, oh, well, we learned something. after a failure.
So it's about building a culture of rigorous experimentation.
Rigorous experimentation applied to management itself. It echoes Frederick Taylor, the scientific management guy, who said in the future the system must be first over individual genius. But crucially, lean startup avoids Taylor's rigidity. It's not a rigid blueprint. It's an adaptive framework.
And the ultimate goal?
The ultimate goal is to answer the most important question of our time. It's no longer can it be built. We can build almost anything now. Our productive capacity is immense. The real question is, should it be built? Does it create real value? Do anyone want it? Ries concludes that our future prosperity depends on the quality of our collective imaginations, and, I would add, our ability to rigorously test those imaginations against reality.
Wow. That's a powerful way to frame it. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the myths of entrepreneurship to the nuts and bolts of build, measure, learn, acceleration, and building adaptive systems. It really is a transformative way to think about creating anything new.
It really is. And the core lesson, I think, goes way beyond just tech startups. It's about embedding this relentless commitment to learning, to adapting based on evidence, to finding out what truly creates value, whether you're launching a product, running a project, or even improving a process.
So the final thought for you, the listener, might be this. What assumptions are you operating under right now? In your work, maybe in a personal project, maybe even just in your daily routines. What might you discover if you applied that steering wheel, that build, measure, learn loop, with real curiosity and, importantly, the courage to pivot if the data tells you to?
Because the lean startup isn't really a destination you arrive at. It's a continuous journey, isn't it? A process of ongoing experimentation. And the resources you need for that journey, they're often right there, your immediate environment, your colleagues, your direct customers. As Ries says, reading is good, action is better.
So true. This isn't just a philosophy for big companies or startups. It really feels like a powerful toolkit for anyone trying to innovate, trying to make a real impact in a world that's full of uncertainty.